refuge to the Buddha, who's the teacher. The Dharma, which is the actual refuge. And to the Sangha, who help and progress on the path. And then we generate our motivation. And we're here discussing teachings. With the motivation of compassion. To progress on the path in order to out of compassion for ourselves and for others. Or liberate all sentient beings from suffering. Remember the attitude of universal responsibility. As you feel it, I'm discussing the Dharma because I recognize that others' happiness and well-being totally depends on me, just as my happiness and well-being totally depends on them. So I happily take on complete responsibility, not just to free myself from suffering, but to free every sentient being as vast as the vastness of space. I can't liberate them from suffering in my current state, so I have to practice, study, contemplate, meditate, in order to achieve Buddhahood, so I can be of benefit to all sentient so we can come to more interactive mode. So today we'll go over, discuss a little bit and meditate on the 12 links of dependent origination. So maybe first I'll just go through what are the 12 links, then we'll talk about how do you contemplate. So last time we went through the first three, right? So the first is ignorance. And in this context, ignorance, can include ignorance of the nature of karma, right? Karmic causality, causal relationships. And then the primary ignorance here is that pervades all sentient beings in samsara is the ignorance that grasps at the psychophysical aggregates, right? So at the body and mind as me and as mine. So thinking that there's a truly existent, independent me somewhere on or in our body and mind. That kind of ignorance. And so that motivated, so these first three links go together. So motivated by that kind of ignorance, then there's what they call karmic, causal karma or karmic formations, sometimes call it. The second link, right? So it means motivated by that action one has done, karmic actions and so one has done actions motivated by ignorance. That's really what that means. And those karmas in this context, in terms of the wheel of dependent origination, it includes actually, negative karmic actions, also positive karmic actions are included, because that's still within samsara. And then what they call also unchanging karmic actions. And those are concentration, states of deep concentration that are still in action. They're still karma, but they're not like they're not what what we ordinarily think of as action is like doing doing something or going out, and whether it's a thought or a verbal action, like complimenting somebody or insulting somebody. But in this, there's a third category which we don't actually, none of us here probably experience very much. But it's for example, concentrating on the formless realms, or to be an example of that. So it's a very deep meditative state, but it's still samsara. It's still done with the ignorance grasping it truly existent I and mind. So it's just the third category of another kind of karma. So in other words, even yogis who can meditate very deeply, the point is that meditation in and of itself doesn't liberate you from. That's the reason why they include that in a way, as a reminder to us that even deep meditation, if it's not conjoined with the wisdom that destroys ignorance, still just becomes a cause, a karmic seed, a karmic cause for more samsara. Does that make sense? That's important. That's why even though we don't, most of us here probably aren't experiencing like form realm meditations or formless realm, these like kind of deep meditative states. The point there is to remind us that even at our level, that those still are just another kind of action that leads to another kind of rebirth in samsara. Because if you haven't destroyed the first link of ignorance, then you're still creating samsara. And so that's the second link is action, right, or karmic formation. Because karma means action. Right? And then the third link actually is called consciousness, right? And there are two. This includes the causal consciousness, which means, in other words, when you do an action, it's imprinted. You could say sometimes they say it like this: it's imprinted on the consciousness, right? So you've created a karmic seed, in a sense, in your consciousness. That consciousness, the third link of consciousness, can also include the resultant consciousness later when that seed ripens. Does that make sense? So when you do the action, you're creating a seed. And this is an important point: is that when you create the cause of a karmic seed, a cause, right, the result doesn't manifest immediately. And sometimes if you think about it, actually, it can seem like, what's the way to say this? It was almost like you could wish that karma would ripen right away, then it would be more obvious, like, whereas, if you insult it, if let's say you, how should I say this? If when people stole, they immediately experienced the result right in that moment, well, nobody would steal, right? Part of the problem is that, like, the result, there's a gap, right? And so people don't, and we actually, that's pretty obvious, right? Like, whereas, like, for example, if thieves were arrested every time, the instant they started to steal, if they were arrested, then they wouldn't steal, right? Since the arrest comes later, there's some idea like that. So it's like so karma, anyway, so there's a gap between when the karmic cause is created and when the seed ripens. So consciousness can include when the seed, you see what I mean? When you imprint the seed, but also when it ripens on the consciousness. And so actually, maybe I'll just pause there. I want to actually, there are different ways of numbers, there are different ways of describing how many lifetimes one is talking about when one talks about the 12 links of dependent origination. But I'm going to describe them in terms of 3 lifetimes. Of how these would work over the course of 3 lifetimes. So you, right, in a past life, motivated by ignorance. So now we're in the first lifetime, some past life, right? So you here, in some past life, motivated by ignorance, since you're all human here, you created some positive karmic action. Since you did something very positive, otherwise you wouldn't be a human being, you'd be some other kind of being, right? And that imprint, that karmic imprint, was imprinted on your consciousness. Right? And then due to that positive karma, right, now we're going to get to the present life, right? It's ripened in your present experience. Does that make sense? And so we're going to go through the next few links in terms of this life. So that was a past life, right? Motivated by ignorance, you created karma, it imprinted on the consciousness, which resulted in a good rebirth as a human being. So then, we're going to go into the next links are this life, okay? Because I'm presenting it in terms of 3 lifetimes. So that was a past life, right? Now this life, right? So, you know, what happened, right? So after you, because of that karma, right? After you died in your last life, right? Your consciousness, right, it became the effect consciousness. So it had a seed in it, right? Then there was an effect consciousness where that seed ripened, as, and you took rebirth, right? So the fourth link is the beginning of that rebirth process of this life now. So they call it the fourth link. They call it name and form, or sometimes you call it name or form, in a way. Because formless realm beings don't have form. So there's an exception to the form part, but we have form, so we can say name. For us, we can say name and form. So what name and form really mean, though, in this context, is form is your body, right? And in this context, name really refers to the other mental aggregates. You know, so your feelings, discrimination, consciousness, you know, and so on. Your intentions, all that, right? So name and form, in a sense, you could just call it your body and mind. Right? And so those began in the womb, right? Since we're human, we're womb-born creatures, right? So those began to form in the womb. You know, first as one cell, two cells, and so on. Right? And so we began, because of our past karma, we began developing into this body and mind. Right? The current, like, projected result, you could call it, of a past karma. And so we started to develop a body and a mind of a human being. So that's the fourth link. Right? And then as you continue developing, you develop, as a embryo, right? You developed the fifth link, which they sometimes call, he translates it as sources, but really it's like, descriptively it's the senses, your senses. And so there, actually in this one, just to be clear, there are two things, like they develop one after another, they don't all develop at the same time, right? It's a gradual process, in other words. But you develop eyes, ears, nose, tongue, right? Your physical sense, and the mental sense, right? And just to be clear, in Buddhism, they talk about this, that there are two things included in that. One is the gross organ, right, like an eyeball. But then the other is, they call it like the subtle sense power. Right? So it's that subtle ability, because a person can have an eyeball but still be blind, right? You have to have a sense power there. You've got like the nerve endings or something in Western terminology. And the same with the ear, right? There's the gross organ, but then there's like a subtle
sense faculty.
Sense faculty or sense power that's inside the organ, right, that allows you to hear, to see, to smell, and so forth, taste. Right. So we have in this one, right, the name and form. So body and mind started forming, then the senses formed, right. And now, once the senses have formed, right, automatically the sixth link begins, which is contact. Now, what that means, right, is that once you have senses, you start to contact you start to have contact with objects of sound, right? So even in the womb, the baby starts to hear, right? Hear the mom talking, dad talking, hear other sounds, right? And then, and then as and have physical sensations, right? And then as you're born, right, all kinds of sensations start happening, right? So you start seeing things, hearing things, smelling things, tasting things, touching, and thinking thoughts, right? So does that make sense? So there's contact at that point. So first you have to have and actually for contact there has to be numerous things. One is you have to have a functioning organ, right, like an eye, right? Then there has to be an object to see, right, with light, and all that. And then there has to also be consciousness there, right? You have to have an awareness, right? And then you have contact. So then contact, right, the sixth link, automatically gives rise to the seventh link, which is feeling. Right, so as soon as there's contact with objects, without any choice, automatically you start having either feelings of either pleasure, pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, or neutral feelings. Right? And you can't escape that. As long as you're alive, right, you're either finding something pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And actually, everything you have contact with, right? Every sensation you have, there's those one of those three feeling tones is present. And then Actually, that's happening all the time, isn't it? If you think about it, right? So there's always contact, right? And then there's always, I mean, throughout our lives, there's contact and then there's this feeling. Right? And then, for us ordinary beings, right, feeling automatically gives rise to the eighth link, which there are different translations. He calls it attachment. Sometimes people call it craving. You can translate it either way, craving or attachment. So that one, right, once you have feeling, then it's automatic, right? You can actually see this in your own experience, right? Once you have feeling, automatically there's a, I'm going to call it craving, right? There's either craving to, if it's pleasant feeling, then you start craving having more of that, right? Like I want more, I want more. If it's an unpleasant feeling, right, then you start craving getting away from it. You crave to not have that and to have some other feeling. You know, and even neutral ones actually are craving for to have them become pleasurable ones. Right? So automatically, you see, as long as you have that contact and feeling, then you start giving rise to craving. Right? And then I'll mention the ninth link, and then I want to explain something about these two. Okay, but so craving, and then the ninth link is grasping, and what grasping is the same as craving but more intense. Does that make sense? So it's like, and just to give an analogy on those, it's like in ordinary life, it's like this, like the difference between, like, like craving is a weaker form and grasping is stronger. So it'd be like if you see a commercial, you know, for like something, right? Then there's a feeling of, first there's craving, like thinking, oh, that'd be nice, you know. And then if you see the commercial over and over again, and then you're starting to feel dissatisfied about, you know, like you're bored or something, right? Then grasping arises, where it's like, not just would that be nice, that would be nice, but like I've got to go out and get that. I'm going to go get in the car. I've got to go, you know, I'm bored here. I've got to go get something, and you sort of rush out to get it. Does that make sense? So grasping is like is an intensified form of craving, and we see that in our daily lives, right, all the time. Because there is a difference between thinking, oh, I would like more of this, and then sort of saying, I need more of that. It's a kind of intense form. So in this life, right, we have, you can see that actually we have those, right? We have the sense sources, right? We have contact, we have feeling, and we have craving and grasping. And because, as Buddhism says, this is a desire realm, right? We're in a realm, we're in what the Buddha called our realm, the desire realm. Right? So all the time, what he was implying is occasionally you have anger, right? Occasionally you have jealousy, occasionally you have pride, but craving and grasping are our baseline experience, actually. In other words, they're almost always. That's why he emphasizes those in a sense. Is that it's craving and grasping, it's desire that when you look around motivates people the vast majority of the time. Occasionally we get some other afflictive emotion, but most of the time we're in craving and grasping.
So for the eight what concerns become a craving?
Yeah, craving would, craving and grasping would be, the eight worldly concerns would be one version, or some of the things that we crave and grasp for, right? So you can crave, and there's a list of usually in our life it's usually the eight worldly concerns that we're craving and grasping for, right? So, pleasure. We're craving after right pleasure, after good reputation, after those things. Yeah, sure.
So just a quick question: Is aversion a form of grasping?
In this sense, they would include it. Yeah, in that sense, like that you're grasping to get away from the unpleasant. Yeah. So they would include that.
So if you're having a strong aversive reaction to something, you're grasping at what? Something else. That you want.
Yeah, grasping at something else, or at the escape of that to be something. Even if you're really, you might be grasping at something else that you want to have, or you might just be grasping to get to a neutral feeling. Right? Like I just want to get away from this. In that moment, you may not even be looking to something pleasurable. You might just be looking to get away from, in order to sort of get back to neutral. But then, as soon as you get to neutral, you'll want something else.
So if you're caught in heavy traffic and you're feeling aversion to that, is that grasping?
Yeah. And then continuing with this presentation of it over 3 lifetimes, right? So your whole life, you're just having contact, feeling, craving, and grasping. Right? basically it's this Buddha's description of your life, right? Is he looks at ordinary people and he says that's what they do, right? Then you come to the end of your life, right? Which, as the Buddha said, your birth guarantees, right? Just the fact that you were born guarantees you'll die, right? Because that's an important point, actually, isn't it? And that's not mentioned in the links of the Penduration, but it's implied. Is that being born human, you don't need something external to you to cause your death, right? Like, in other words, just having been born human, that is the cause of your death, actually. Does that make sense? Whereas, like, we sometimes think, like in autopsy things, like, what's the cause of death? Birth, in a sense. Like, it'd be a more profound answer. Because even if you don't, right, if you can avoid, if you avoid this and that, if you avoid certain causes of death, you're still going to die, right? Whereas, like you say, oh, this person didn't get cancer, but they still die, right? Like, in other words, you didn't get heart disease, you still die. Whereas, because our body's made by, its very nature is to wear out. Actually, the Buddha said that, right? He said, all compounded phenomena are impermanent, right? Compounded means, so it came together from causes and conditions. So anything that comes together from causes and conditions, by its very nature, falls apart, right? Whether it's your body, whether it's relationships, like whether it's a Dharma center, right? The Buddha said his own teaching said that, right? Whereas if it comes together, it'll fall apart. If it comes together due to causes and conditions, then everything ends, right? Everything that comes together and begins has to have an ending. So our life is going to end, right? So the Buddha is now describing these. Now I'm going to talk about craving and grasping, those same two links at the end of life, right? So what happens is, right, you spend your whole life craving and grasping, right? And then the time of your death approaches, right? And so what do ordinary people, ordinary means people who haven't seen emptiness, right? That's what ordinary people. So what do ordinary people do as they're approaching death, right? Well, they start craving, right? And the Buddha, our Buddhist teaching sometimes lists, there are different things you can crave, that people crave for as they're approaching death. So some people are still craving, like, physical things, right? Like, oh, I want some, sometimes you see that where somebody can't drink, you're dying and you can't drink, so they're craving a drink, right? Or they're feeling cold and they're craving warmth. Or they feel hot and they're craving coolness. So that sometimes you're craving for physical things as you die. And if you watch people die, this is true, right? Sometimes it's not physical, right? Sometimes people's craving is just like for their sense of self, right? Whereas your sense of self is being taken away, right? And so sometimes there's just a craving for, like, to be me, or craving for your sense of identity. Sometimes you can be craving for your role, right? Like some role you had in life. Sometimes you can also be craving for a certain, like, philosophical thing, like you want something to be true as you're dying, right? And then, so you're craving, for sure, as an ordinary person, as they're dying, they're craving, right? I mean, if we crave now just because we're bored, right? Can you imagine when you're in pain and dying and losing your senses, right? Losing your ability to move, of course you crave, right? And then as death gets closer, the craving becomes extremely intense, grasping. Right? It actually becomes a very, very powerful kind of grasping at, again, it could be grasping at physical things, but it's also a grasping at wanting to still exist, right? That's what happens as people die. And so now what the Buddha is saying is this, so craving and grasping are actually causes to have karmic seeds ripen. In life that's true, actually, and then at death it's particularly true. And so as you're dying, that craving and that grasping at things activates, just like it does it throughout your life. It activates. In this case, though, it activates another karmic seed, but during your life it activates karmic seeds for what's the way to say this, for they call them completing karmas, right? For details of your experience in life. At the time of death, it's a throwing karma. And if you read in the Lam Rim, they say so. It's a karma that throws you to another life, which means it was something created by ignorance, action, and imprinted on your consciousness earlier, right? Whether it was in this life or a past life. But that craving and that grasping activate a karmic seed, which leads to the 10th link, which is becoming or existence. Right? So it means continued existence in samsara, right? So even though you're dying, right, your craving, your grasping activate a karmic seed, and that karmic seed is going to, in a way, like that. I want to be clear. So this 10th link of existence is actually, there are two links that are karma. The first one was the second link, right? Action, when you create the action. This 10th link is karma at the time of ripening. Does that make sense? So as you're dying, you're ripening a certain karmic seed. So the link, in other words, an action that was created in the past at link 2 is now being ripened at the time of death by the power of your craving and grasping. Does that make sense now? So actually, in a sense, existence or becoming, this 10th link is like a karma ripening that's and causing you to become something. Does that make sense? That's why they call it becoming, even though it's karma, right? The earlier one was called karma because we say, well, you're doing a karmic action. Here it's karma that's ripening, causing you to become. Right? And so the 10th link is kind of as you die, right? You're becoming, the karma is ripening and you're becoming something. And that karmic ripening leads to the 11th link, which is birth. So now we're in the third lifetime, right? You die in this life, you become reborn in another life, which leads to the 12th link, which is aging and death. So those are, at least now we have an overview of what the 12 links are. That was the first goal, right? To kind of explain what they are. People know what aging and death are, right? Actually, from this point of view, they say aging starts at conception. Whereas you start, that's true actually, isn't it? Whereas once you're conceived, you start aging, right? You start getting older. Right? And then you continue that. And actually, you continue, as long as you exist, you continue aging, right? And when does aging stop? Well, it stops at death. You're not getting older anymore at death. Then you're getting younger. You're starting over, and then you start aging again. Right?
So how come they put together aging and death? How come it comes together? Aging.
It's an interesting question, right? Why does he put aging and death together? It's interesting. Like, I guess what I want to say is this: I think in my actually, well, let's look at it really carefully because I think it's a complicated question actually. But if you look at this, like, for example, let's go back to the middle set, right? The one that I was describing as this life, right? So having a body and a mind, name and form, the senses and contact and feeling and craving and grasping, right? Well, all those are happening while you're aging and dying, right? So it's a little complicated in this way that actually it depends on your perspective. It's like I was presenting it one way of looking at it, right? Which is that in terms of the sequence, right? That in the past life you created an action caused by ignorance. Now in the present life you're having craving and grasping, because you have why do you have craving and grasping? Because you have contact, right? Because you have feeling. Why do you have feeling? Because you have contact. Why do you have contact? Because you have senses, right? Now, while you're doing that, right, if you look at it from another point of view, you are aging in death, right? Right now you're in aging and death, right? You were already born, and you're in aging and death now, right? And while you're doing aging and death, you're creating the first link, right? Ignorance, karma, and making imprints on your consciousness. How often are you doing that, actually, right? From a Buddhist perspective, say all the time, right? In other words, every time you do something, everything you do actually is caused by ignorance, right? That's what Buddha. Whereas we haven't yet realized emptiness, so everything we do is everything we do, what underlies it is a sense of I and mine, actually, right? So we're creating so many karmic seeds. And so I think the reason why Buddha linked it that way, which now we're going to get into, is for meditation purpose. In other words, to actually realize something about the nature of our life. Because the Buddha could have said there also, going to parties, sleeping, eating. He could have listed all those things too, right? Chatting with our friends, whatever. He could have listed endless numbers of things there. But he listed it in that way, I think, because this is useful for us to meditate on. So I think that's really, it's a skillful way of presenting it. And so let's go into that, right? So because I think, it could seem a little complicated, right? 12 links over 3 lifetimes. You can also present them over longer lifetimes, right? Because sometimes this karmic seed can be, many lifetimes ago, and it won't result, for many lifetimes and so on. But I think the idea, I want to get into this, like we said before, that it's almost like these 12, they call them 12 links, right? But you could almost think of this as like a machine, right? A machine to produce suffering. It has 12 parts, right, the way the Buddha described it, but it's like they call it a wheel, right? Well, a wheel is, there's a wheel is the earliest, actually wheel is the earliest, probably, machine, in a way, right? And so these 12 links are like a machine that produces samsara, right? That produces, which means, and remember, what is samsara? It's, because this module, samsara and nirvana, right? So what's samsara? It's our body and mind, right? It's not something other than us. Which is clear here, right? Name and form. And so, I think the idea, one way, there are different benefits to meditating on this, but one part is this, is if you actually start to contemplate now what this is saying, right? It's saying like, once you're born, like, or, let's say us, right? Once we're born, right? Then actually we're totally out of control, right? That's, if you contemplate what this is saying, right? Because I can't stop, actually. Whereas I have no ability to stop, I have senses, right? And so I can't, in other words, no matter what I do, I have contact, right? Whereas, and I actually can't escape that. And I can't escape that contact gives rise to feelings, right? And if you actually check your own experience, right? So you look, right? All the time, like, there are sensations going on, right? That's what contact is, right? Or sensations, right? And so you actually analyze it. It's not just like, you can actually analyze your own experience and you say, wow, so actually like, from the time I was a little kid until this morning, and every instant, right? Like on the drive here, every instant there was like, I was actually seeing and hearing so much stuff, right? And feeling so much, and all the time that's giving rise to feelings, right? And if you actually check, many of the feelings are unpleasant, right? And then occasionally you have a pleasant feeling, right? And then all the time, and actually, even if I try to stop, right, grasping happens so easily because I was reborn in the desire realm, as I said earlier, right? So whatever I do, like I'm giving rise to craving and grasping, actually. And now I'm going to bring in the first 3 links, right? And I'm creating the causes to do this. Like how many, it's like this is just one life, right? But all the time I'm creating so many causes, right? It's because I'm always, all the time, actually there's never a time, I never have a break from ignorance. Like in other words, all the time I'm grasping, now I'm not talking about the grasping here, but there's like, I'm believing that there's a truly existent, independent I on my body and mind, in here somewhere. Right? I never get a break from that. And so everything I do, actually, is creating causes for more birth and death, right? For more lifetimes. And so, actually, if you start to meditate on that, it should become quite disturbing, actually, right? Because, okay, occasionally, first of all, like this life is actually one of the best lives you could ever have in samsara. We went over that in Precious Human Rebirth, right? And yet, this life is completely dissatisfactory, right? Like it's not good enough. If you look at it, this life is not, it's not okay even, right? But most of the causes I'm creating are for lives worse than this, right? Whereas this life was created by very virtuous karma, right? So like, actually it says that, right? If you study the teachings, right? To create the life you have now, what you did, right, in some past life was you created some kind of positive motivation. You kept ethics, right? So you were thinking, restraining yourself from harming others. You were being generous, right? So you were, and you were being patient, right? Which are all hard to do. We know that from this life, right? It's really hard to be both ethical, generous, and patient. And then you dedicated it. You said, through this virtue, may I have a good future rebirth where I can practice Dharma and be, and be happy and benefit others and so on, right? Like, most of our actions are not like that, right? I'm not even talking about, like, obviously people do occasionally, like, very, very negative actions, like killing or something. But I'm not even talking about that, right? I'm just talking about, like, go through the first 3 links, right? Motivated by craving and grasping, let's talk about like, because they talk about intense, mild, and sort of intense, moderate, and mild negative actions. So I'm going to talk about mild one, right? I'm not talking about now about like the 10 non-virtuous actions, even in the sense of something severe, but just let's say, you wake up and you feel dissatisfied because you're hungry, right? So it's like, you feel hungry, and then you think, I want to eat, and you go down and you eat, right? So that's an action, right? But it's not a positive karmic action, right? It's not, you're not hurt, you're not doing something terrible, right? But it's not, there's no, you're not motivated by compassion or love, or you're motivated by desire. It's not virtue at all. You're just motivated by desire. And when they asked Lama Atisha, what's the result of that? He said, only suffering. There is actions motivated by desire only lead to suffering. Right? So, and actually, since that's a mild one, they would say, well, it would probably lead to rebirth as an animal. Right? There's like just some kind of animal rebirth, right? And then, like, you think, I gotta go to work, right? And so I'll go, because and actually, most people, actually, what do you think? Like, you don't even think why. You just think, oh, I'm supposed to go to work. I don't really want to, but I have to, or something like that. And then you get in the car, you go to work, right? So actually, again, there's no positive karma there. Your mind is not, you're not thinking, I'm going to work to be of benefit to others, and I desperately want to be of help to all sentient beings. Most of the time, people aren't thinking that way, right? They're just thinking, oh, I have to go to work, time to go to work. And maybe they have some thought, I don't know, my boss or something, whatever. And they're driving to work, right? So then that's not a positive karma, right? So again, it's cause of a whole rebirth, like that's karmic action, cause of a rebirth, right? And then, like on the way to work, somebody cuts you off or something like that, you get mad, right? Well, then you created a heavier negative karma, right? Like, and maybe you honk at them, or you just think, whatever, not a long curse. So, that's another negative, right? So all day, actually, you're creating karmic, through ignorance, grasping at a truly existent self, you're creating actions that are being imprinted on your consciousness, right? And so you spend almost all your life doing that, right? Many people, like, if you look, actually, it's possible, right? You could live a whole lifetime and never create a positive karma, actually. It wouldn't be hard to do, actually, right? If positive karma is an action motivated by, what? Like, at least, right, aspiring to a good future rebirth, or aspiring to become liberated from samsara. Now, there are positive karmas motivated by very pure love, right? Love where you're not expecting something in return, or compassion where you're not trying to manipulate somebody to get something. But if you ask yourself, well, how often do I do something? If I look at my life and what I'm doing day and night, right? Like when you go to sleep, right? If you go to sleep just grasping at, like, you're feeling tired, right? And you're feeling like stressed by the day and stressed by life, and you just think, I just want like some kind of oblivion. Right? That's the feeling, right? And then you go to sleep just seeking, like craving and grasping at a kind of oblivion of nothing, sort of like to feel nothing, right? Actually, what's the karma of that, right? That's not a karma to have wisdom or have some kind of enlightenment. Actually, it's probably another karma for some kind of animal-like existence, right? And so, like the idea, or so what the Buddha is getting at, if you start contemplating, is like you think, wow, so like hour after hour after hour, I'm creating these karmas motivated by ignorance, and they're all going to ripen as rebirths and as suffering, right? And most of them will be worse than this life. And if I'm lucky, if occasionally, I go to some Dharma teaching and I take some vow or something, oh, may I not harm others, or if I, make some sincere aspiration like that, every now and then we do something positive because we're lucky, actually, that we have, we're the most lucky practically on the planet. So every now and then we create some positive karma, but even that's still, according to this, right? Well, that's just another cause of another rebirth like this one, right? It's not. Whereas, unless you're really motivating by bodhicitta or by true renunciation, but even if you're motivated by, for example, renunciation, right? If the action you're doing is still conditioned by ignorance, well, you're creating a cause for rebirth like this, right? In other words, not for you're not creating a direct cause to actually achieve liberation. You're not creating a cause that's going to end samsara. You're creating a cause that's still within the cycle of the 12 links, aren't you? Right? That's just a positive one. But you're still within these 12 links. And so, if you analyze it, right, and then like this thing of birth and then aging and death, right, the point there, if you think about it, is that if you actually meditate on those two links, right, actually, if you meditate on those enough, it can almost make you nauseous, actually, right? Because it's like, the idea of that is like, so you're born, and you age, and you die. And you're born, and you age, and you die. The idea in Buddhism is you think like that, right? And you think, oh my God, like we pay so much attention to some details. I think that's why they say birth, aging, and death. We pay a lot of attention to, well, did somebody smile at me today? And did I get a raise or not? And like, did I, whatever, like, even like what, I didn't get to see that movie when it was in the movie theater or something, like, such trivial things. And what the Buddha is saying here is like, I think if you contemplate it, you start to feel it, it's like, you're born, you age, and you die. You're born, you age, and you die. It happens, and it's been happening since beginningless time, and it's going to continue until you achieve enlightenment or liberation. And the idea is like, that if you meditate on that, right, and then you think all these things that I think about all the time are so stupid, actually, totally idiotic, actually, and that's, I think, what the Buddha is getting at. If you, we compare the way we think about our life to what the Buddha is saying. This is the Buddha giving us advice, right? And the Buddha is saying, look, like, you were born, you're aging, and you're going to die, like, that's what's actually going on here, right? And all the time, all you're doing is craving and grasping and creating. I'm jumping around the 12 links for a minute, but and creating causes of more and more and more samsara, right? And it goes on, it can go on endlessly, right? And then you have to analyze. So another analysis here, right, is if you're born, can you just stop aging and dying? Like, we try that in our culture. It doesn't work though, right? Like, you can go to the mall and get like cream, or something, or pills. Actually, you can also get like, go to this. You can take some kind of vitamins or something.
You know that.
I try all the different things. It doesn't work. Right. In other words, no matter what you do, if you're born, you can't stop aging and dying. Right.
So is this supposed to lead us to a revulsion with samsara? I mean, this looks like where you're going.
Yeah, it's supposed to lead to renunciation. In other words, this is a contemplation to give rise to renunciation, the middle scope of the Lam Rim. Like, this is one of the ways to give rise to renunciation. So in other words, one way to give rise to renunciation is to think about those different the 3 types of suffering, the 6, the 8, or the 10 types of suffering, right? That's one way to give rise to renunciation. But actually contemplating these 12 links is another way to give rise to renunciation of samsara, exactly. And again, like if you look at it, right, once you have a body with senses, right, in a desire realm, actually you can't stop, right? Again, like you can't stop having feel. You can't, you could say, okay, I'm not going to feel anything. It doesn't work, actually, right? Then you think, damn, why am I feeling something? And you're already feeling about not feeling, or whatever. You can't escape feeling, right? And as long as you're in the desire realm, a certain amount of desire just happens, right? And so if you analyze it, actually, right, then there's a one way of going backwards, right? If you want to stop aging and death, you have to stop birth, right? If you want to stop birth, you have to stop having karma ripen. But but to stop having karma ripen, you have to stop grasping. To stop grasping, you have to stop craving, right? But you can't just stop craving by trying to, right? So what do you have to do? Well, you have to go backwards, and you trace it all the way back. You can't. In other words, if you have feeling, you can't stop. In other words, you'd have to stop having those kind of feelings of pleasure, pain, and neutral. But you can't just stop those in and of themselves, right? As long as you have contact, right? You can't stop contact as long as you have sense organs. You can't stop having sense organs as long as you have a body, right? So, like, in other words, you look and you see, where can I break? It's like almost like if you're looking at this machine and you're saying, well, how do I break this damn thing? How do you crack it so it will stop doing that, right? You can't get rid of your consciousness, right? Because no matter what you do, you have consciousness. So the place to break it, right? You say, well, can I stop doing karmic actions motivated by ignorance grasping at an eye on the body and mind? Well, yes, that one you can stop, but only if you stop the ignorance. So you start to see, like, if you look at the 12 links, right, this is how you give rise to real renunciation. It's not enough. I mean, one step is just to look at it and go, this is sickening, actually. Like, to keep giving rise to, like, to keep taking births, most of which are going to be worse than this one. And so, this one alone, right, you have to go through, like, junior high again, or something. No, I'm joking. But, I mean, this one alone has so much difficulty, right? But then most lives are, like, actually, we have the best life Actually, if you look around, actually, it's true, right? Or you don't have to even, I mean, there are 6 realms in Buddhism, right? That are depicted here in the 12, in the Wheel of Life. But actually, you don't even have to look at those, right? Like, how many, you know, like we say, you know, we do about precious human rebirth, right? I mean, if you just think, how many cicadas are there versus humans, right? When the cicadas come, right, they're going to come soon, aren't they? Like, actually, if you look at the number, right, and then you think, like, they're all sentient beings, right? Just like me. They created karma, just like I did, that threw them into a life. And for 17 years, they've been in the dirt, right? Like, in a little, what's it, like some kind of little form, way down under the earth, right? And for 17 years, they sat there, and then they crawl out, and they fly around for what, like a week or two? And then somebody steps on one. You know, like, you might be the one somebody steps on, or drives over, or hits somebody's car, or birds eat them, right? And then, you know, some of them reproduce and then they die, right? And that's it. And then 17 more years or something. Like, and so you just look at that, right? And you think, oh, and like that's what's going on over and over and over. And like, and I have the best one, right? Like, even, I mean, hardly any, if you look on this planet, right? Just put aside the other realms, right? Hardly any creature is human, actually. Almost everything on this planet is an animal, right? Like a cicada. Or what are those things that the whales eat? Like these strange plankton and whatever, I don't know. There's all these creatures, right? Like, and then ants, like, how many ants are there, right, on your house, like, your property, where you live, right? Maybe how many people live in your house, humans, and then how many ants are there just on your property, right? And then, of course, like, there's most properties not your property, right? There's like so many ants, like, millions of them, right? Millions and millions and millions. And then most humans, right, they're very rare to be human, and then most of the humans on the planet, right, first of all, they're wasting their lives, and they're living much more difficult lives. They're living more difficult lives than you, right? And then they're not doing anything. Actually, many of them don't do anything virtuous, actually. Like, in other words, they don't do anything, like, they just want to make more money or more.
Can I just pause you? I wrote this down, but I don't think I got it right. You said the way to break the mechanism. I really try to get it.
Yeah.
I don't think I got this right. Can I just check with
Yeah,
you?
yeah.
Is to do virtuous deeds that benefit others and break the grasping at a non-existent self?
So actually, even doing virtuous deeds, actually, I mean, you have to do virtuous deeds, of course. But that doesn't break this wheel, actually, right?
Okay.
In other words, a person could do, because actually think about it, like, this is what's sort of disturbing about this, actually. Again, it's good, we have to do virtuous deeds, of course, right? So you have better rebirths, because if you take birth as a cicada, there's no chance of getting liberation, you know? There is no cicada is going to escape samsara in that lifetime, right? But the problem is, even if you do a whole bunch of virtuous deeds motivated by ignorance, right? Look at if you just look at what the Buddha said, ignorance grasping at a truly existent eye on the body and mind gives rise to, if you do action motivated by that, it creates an imprint on the consciousness. So even if you do virtuous deeds, that just projects a life like this, right? So the only way to break the mechanism really is at the point of ignorance. So in other words, you have to destroy, if you completely destroy ignorance, grasping at a truly existent or an independent I and mind, thinking that they exist in these aggregates in this body and mind. If you can anybody can, right? In other words, it's possible to realize, and why, actually, I'm just going to say this because this is important, actually, right? So the link of ignorance, right? If we call that ignorance grasping at an independent I, the I and mind, on this body and this mind, right? In other words, what the Buddha really is saying here is this, is that wisdom that perceives clearly and eventually directly, right, the lack of such an I, the lack of such an independent I, self, on the body and mind, is a direct antidote to that ignorance. So wisdom counteracts. It's like it can completely destroy it because it's the exact opposite, right? So wisdom that sees that doesn't exist completely destroys that kind of ignorance. And if you destroy that kind of ignorance, then it no longer exists, right? And so if you can destroy that link, that's the weak point, in a sense, in these 12 links, so the only way to destroy the 12 links of dependent origination is at the point of ignorance, really. If you don't realize, and that's why, like Nagarjuna said, Right? If you don't realize emptiness, then there's no end.
So is it that everything, even virtuous stuff that you do, if you haven't realized emptiness, it's still a cause for samsara? So you,
Perpetuating the karma, your karma.
In other words, if you look at it from the point of view of the 12 links, then right, it's still creating causes for rebirth, actually, right? Whereas as long as now within that, right? If in other words, if you're doing some now, if you're doing something with if you're doing like I'm trying to say this the right way, like let's say this, like actually I'll give this example, like even a bodhisattva, right? Like up and like we went through this before, that there are like 5 paths, right? So there's the path of accumulation, right, which begins when somebody just realizes bodhicitta. Then there's the path of preparation, which so the person who realizes bodhicitta practices and studies and learns to meditate, and when they come to the point where they've realized calm abiding and unified that with special insight, which means they've gained an inferential understanding of emptiness at that point, but not direct perception. They've entered the path of preparation.
So accumulation and then preparation.
Preparation.
So preparation is when you realize calm abiding and special
And special
insight.
insight, yeah.
Okay.
So accumulation is bodhicitta, right?
Accumulation, you've realized, and the Mahayana, yeah, you've realized bodhicitta.
So what about like, path accumulation, they say like small, middle, and great.
Great, yeah.
So what's the difference, small, middle?
We'll go over. Actually, I don't want to cover this right now because it's a complicated topic. I'll just cover general. But we will go over it because then there are 4 parts of the path of preparation. There's heat and peak and
Yeah.
So preparation
patience
is
and
karma binding.
yeah. On the path of accumulation, you can have realized karma binding, but the union of that, there is when that becomes unified with special insight. That's when you move to the path of preparation. And preparation means you're preparing to directly perceive emptiness, which is the path of seeing, the 3rd path.
Oh, I see.
So in the path of seeing, which is the 3rd of the 5 paths, you directly perceive emptiness. And so the point I was just making, the only reason I was mentioning, I'll go into detail, we will cover it another time, but just briefly I want to say, so when somebody's on the path of accumulation, when somebody's realized bodhicitta, right, then, like, when they're doing so many positive actions at that point, right, they're like doing a lot of, because they've actually realized bodhicitta, and they're creating causes to benefit others very extensively. But actually at that point, they still, when they do an action, or is it still controlled by the force of ignorance? They haven't yet directly seen emptiness, right? And so actually they're still creating causes for more rebirths in samsara. Now they're creating causes for excellent rebirths and for rebirths to continue
so
practicing
it's not
the
that
path.
what they're doing is negative,
No.
it's just not enough to get them all the way there.
And there's not enough to get them out of samsara. After the bodhisattva has realized, after they've achieved the path of seeing, then when they're doing actions motivated by bodhicitta, they're not creating the causes of other rebirths, additional rebirths in samsara. So that's the point where the person stops creating the causes to be reborn in samsara. So either one is doing positive actions that are of great benefit, but the one is still the one that can't help it. In other words, you don't have even though they've realized renunciation, right? Or somebody who's realized bodhicitta by nature has realized renunciation, right? So they don't any longer have. They want to be liberated from samsara the way a prisoner wants to be liberated from jail, right? But because they've not seen emptiness directly, without any choice, they're still creating now they're creating virtuous causes of good rebirths, but they're still within those rebirths will still be within samsara until they achieve, and you won't stop creating those until you see emptiness directly. Does that make sense? So, so ignorance is the only point where you can break this. So does that clearly answer your? So you have to break it at ignorance.
Well, it answers it in this very kind of a like. I don't understand the let's say I understand that ignorance, that's grasping at an illusory self, is the weak point in the chain, and that wisdom, I'm just saying what I've written down here, that perceives a lack of independent I, is an antidote to the ignorance. But let's say I'm going to do study, contemplation, and meditation on that. Well, where do I go with now? I've heard the concept, and I'm really now I want to take it to the contemplation level, and then I want to take it to the meditation level, because that's what we learned about last week, that you know, what happens with these lectures and these discussions is that almost all of us we get stuck at the first level. We hear the concept, maybe we understand the English or what was said, maybe we think we understand, but we don't really, and then we never really take it to the second or the third level. And we all do this. So the question is, how would we take this concept that you're sharing with us to the contemplation level at the very least, and then the meditation level?
So let's go through that. So like the idea is really important, right? So the idea would be, right, if you like, and you know, so you would let's go to contemplation next, right? So let's say you keep, you know, you read more, or you think more about this, and then eventually you start thinking more deeply about it. So we'll say contemplating, because the first thinking is just to make sure you understand it. That's not really contemplating. That's still study. You know, whereas if you read, like if you listen and you study, you read a book, and you're sort of trying to go, now what does that mean? That's study, right? That's still study, to get a clear conceptual idea of what it's even talking about, right? But then once you gain that, right, then you start contemplating, right? So contemplating actually would be like, would be where, for example, like I was starting to hint at it a few minutes ago, right? So like let's say you sat down, right, and you started like thinking about your day, right? Because now it has to be related to your own experience if it's going to be important to you, right? Otherwise it's going to still be like, I said that joke, like I like that Pabonker, which he said, otherwise it's like, you know, what's the word, like he said, what did he say that thing in Liberation of the Power Yarn, where he said, it's like the vegetables are always floating around the top of the soup, and the soup doesn't get any flavor, and the vegetables are just plopped on the top, like, you know, nothing. And he says it's not very good soup then. So it has to be boiled in to your experience.
Absorbed, is that what you said?
Yeah, it's not absorbed into your experience, is the point. And so, so I think what's really important then, right? Let's take some of the examples, right? So like, actually, okay, I'm going to give an example of one way of doing it, right? So like this one of contact, feeling, attachment, grasp, you know, craving and grasping, and so on. Like so okay, let's try it, right? So let's say you're trying to make that more real now, right? So you understood the concept, right? So you think like this. Okay, so what that's getting, you think, okay, so what the Buddha's getting at there is when you die, what's going to happen, right? The craving and the grasping, activating karma, because we're trying to get renunciation, right? That's what we're aiming at here, is renunciation of samsara, right? So I might think, okay, how would I feel, right, if I walk outside and my car is stolen? I'd completely freak out, right? Like in other words, I don't know how to get home, I don't know how I'm going to get to work, I have to figure out another car, like it would be very upsetting, right? Or, like if my car was there and I got home and my house had burned down, right, I would completely like freak out, right? It'd be like a nightmare, right? I would think, oh my God, this is terrible, right? And you would actually imagine that, right? So you imagine walking outside and there's no car. And then you imagine getting home and you see just like ashes and the firemen are there, right? And like how you would feel, right? You would think, oh my God, like it's, you know, you really get into it. It's not enough I'm just saying it, right? But you'd actually like get into the feeling imagination, like really imagining it and going, oh my God, that'd be terrible, you know. And then they say, well, we're sorry, and you know, like you put it out, goodbye, and they get in their truck and they drive off, right? They're not going to stay there, you know. So that, like there was the firemen, firewomen, whatever, you know, like they're there and they you know. And then they leave, and then you're just there with ashes. Right? And how would I feel then? Like, and you're thinking, well, what do I do? Right? Like, you would even feel like, you know, like totally lost. Right? Or then you think like, if you were with the person who you love the most, and they suddenly died, right? Like unexpectedly, they had a heart attack, which happens every day to somebody. Right? Actually, millions of people have that experience every single day. Right? They're with their loved one, they go to bed, right? Now I'm not talking about you dying yet, right? You're talking about your loved one, right? So if you're married or something, right? Like you go to bed, and then you roll over in the morning, and like, oh, I'm going to get ready for work, and the person's cold. Right? Or you're sitting at dinner, and then, like they plop out, right? It happens like an aneurysm, right? Like somebody had that, right? Where those are even faster than heart attacks, right? Just like that, right? And then they're just dead, and you're calling, right? You call again, like, and then you can imagine the whole experience. So you call 911, and they come, but if it's an aneurysm, for example, right? Which nobody knows they have it until they are dead, usually, right? And then, and you know, then the ambulance workers say, oh, I'm sorry, sir, or sorry, ma'am, and they take the body, right? And then you're like in your house, right? And you think, how would I feel, right? Like, and if you meditate like that, right, then you think, oh my, I would feel totally like, what, like, first of all, grief, but also like lost and desolate and like, what's the word to say this, like, lost, like completely also overwhelmed, and like maybe terrified. I mean, it's different for different people, right? But you think like that, and then you think, okay, because sometimes I notice like where if you, the reason why I'm doing all that, right, is, okay, so how much craving and grasping I have, it's clear then. But also in terms of my own death, right? Because sometimes when somebody says, imagine you're going to die, people say, oh, well, it'll be okay, right? But then for me, actually, when I meditate, the other day I was meditating on this one, I remembered, this is my own meditation, I remembered a line from, what was that movie, Clint Eastwood made, a movie, they won the Academy, Unforgiven, right? And he said, you know, what did he say? Some line like, when you kill a man, you take away everything he has, everything he ever and everything he ever will have. Right? And I thought, I was just thinking, because I thought like, you know, so if I think, oh, I'll be okay if I die, but I won't be okay if my car gets stolen, then I'm stupid, right? Like, because you know, my car got stolen. The day I died, like, I lost my car. You know, the day I died, I lost my house. The day I died, I lost everybody I love. The day I, you know, even if like I can't find a book, I get upset. You know, like, oh, where's that book? You know, oh, but I'll be fine if I die. What's that?
Does that happen to you?
The other day I was thinking, where's that book? I can't find it. You know, like, what's going on? What happened to that book? I thought I was here. You know, like, you know, so I'm just thinking, like, okay, if I can't even think where's the book, well, if I'm dead, I won't find anything. You know, like, my car, my book, my food, my, you know, like,
Yeah, but we don't need it anymore, you see, that's the point.
but that's not how you'll
That's
feel.
the
Yeah.
point. Well, we don't know what we feel by then.
You're describing the grasping that arises when we are facing the prospect of losing our lives. I think that's really,
That's what I'm getting
I
at,
think
yeah.
that's what you're trying to say.
Yeah, and like the same thing, imagine if you got fired, like, because I would get to the identity one, right? Imagine you got fired tomorrow, right? You go into work, and they say, you're fired, right? Like, you know, and like how upset you'd be, but if I die tomorrow, I'm going to lose that too, right? Like, in other words, your whole identity is going to get lost. And the point is actually we're trying to give rise to here you're trying to give rise to grasping, actually. That's what, whereas, you know, you're actually trying to, like, sort of see what's that like. In other words, like, you're trying to, because, and actually the thing about the scared also, I want to say part of what that is like the Buddhist teaching, right? When you die, there's a bardo, right? Between lives. And again, the idea here is like, you can actually, what Ken Rinpoche said, actually the bardo is much more frightening than these experiences, right? Losing your house, I mean, at least there you still have a cell phone, right? Like if you have your cell phone with you and you lose your house, well, you can call somebody, call your insurance company. In the bardo, there's nobody to call, right? Like there's no cell phone and there's nobody to call.
Recognize you.
Nobody will recognize you, and you show up somewhere and you're screaming like, I lost everything, and the person just keeps doing it. They don't see you, right? They can't perceive you. And the idea is that if you meditate on that, right? Actually, you want to meditate on it like there is like the idea is you should get scared. That's the idea in this kind of meditation. Actually, you should. Whereas like is that we're trying to actually become Buddhism calls it realistic fear, right? Healthy fear. That's what you're trying to give rise to in this meditation. So you're asking how do you contemplate? It's like that, right? So you keep doing that until you say, "Oh my God!" Like, you know, it's like, and then the bardo, like where you don't know what, and they say like, you know, there's these howling winds, and you feel like you're falling off a cliff, and you feel like you're being crushed under things, because all the vision. In other words, when you're in the bardo, you don't have a body like ours, right? And so all kinds of weird experiences happen.
But also the grasping from this life is with you.
Right, and so you want.
You still got all that grasping.
Yeah, and how much you want, like, you know, you think that's my office, that's my spouse, that's my house, that's my, but you can't have any of it, and you're karma, and because of becoming, right? This is where you're thinking, right? So, because of my attachment and my grasping, right, then becoming happens, right? Which means some past karma starts to ripen, right? And so, like, sometimes they use it in a metaphor of a karmic wind. It's like a metaphor, right? That the wind of karma drags you, whereas you don't have any control over it because you haven't realized emptiness, right? And so, like, you imagine, like, this is the idea, is you're imagining, okay, so I have all this feeling, like, for me, I'll say, okay, so I have this identity, you know, I have that house, I have this kind of job, I have this kind of, like, relationships and friends, and, you know, I call somebody every week, you know, these are the people I talk to every week, or something like that, right? And then you think, okay, but because of karma, craving and grasping, and then birth and death and becoming, right? And all these processes, so I die. And then what happens? Like my karma drags me off. And let's imagine for a moment that because, let's imagine, okay, I'm imagining me, right? So now imagine, like, let's say I died, and what happened was, even though I made a little bit of good karma sometimes in my life, that let's say I died grasping just at some very simple thing, like let's say, you know, sometimes you can't eat when you're just dying, right? Of course, and so you're just hungry, right? And I think for me, if I don't eat for, like, you know, Right? It doesn't take like a week, right? Because I get hungry really
4
quick,
hours.
you know, 4, 5, 6 hours. At the end of the day, if I don't eat for like 7 hours because of work, you know, 7 hours, then I'm driving home and I'm like kind of a little bit irritable, thinking, oh, I gotta eat something, I'm not in a good mood, you know, I'm hungry. That's after just like 7 hours, right? But if you're dying, I mean, I sat with people in hospice, right? Like sometimes you can't eat at all, you know, like for weeks, right? As you're, you know, and then they pull the feeding tubes or whatever out because you're dying, right? And then you're just laying there, right? You can't eat because your body's shutting down. And so if I get irritable after 7 hours, then for sure, if I die in some hospice somewhere, like I might die grasping at food, right? And if I die grasping at food and not being able to eat, and like with that kind of feeling, you know, it's like desperation, then I'll take rebirth as a hungry ghost, right? That's what, otherwise I can think for myself, that's what would happen, right? Whereas what kind, because the craving and the, I didn't mention this detail, right? But the craving and the grasping, what kind of craving and grasping you have partly affects what karma ripens. Does that make sense? In other words, it calls forth certain kinds of karmas, right? And so, if I were to be hungry in a hospice and then like feeling starving and then I'm dying like that, and I'm just thinking, oh, all I want is some food, and I don't feel good, and you know, I want to eat, I want to eat, I want to eat. You know, you're dying with that kind of grasping. Well, with that ripens, that's not going to ripen your best karma, right? It's going to ripen some karma of related to, usually related to the hungry ghost realm. You know, so then, imagine, right? So then I'm in the bardo, I'm dying and I'm in the bardo, and I have this idea I'm supposed to be this person with a house and friends and this and that and identity. But then meanwhile, I'm starting to be pulled into the hungry ghost realm. Right? Well, actually, that's like, you know, it's utterly horrific, actually. You know, and you know that your life is going to be longer than your whole life here was. And this life starts to seem like a dream. You know, when you wake up from a dream, and like you know that feeling when you wake up from a dream and you want to remember it, but you like after you start to forget it if you have to get up. Like, you know, let's say your alarm's ringing, right? And the alarm's ringing and it's an annoying sound and you're starting to forget the dream. My whole life will have been like that. In other words, like the alarm of the hungry ghost realm, I'm using metaphor here, is ringing, right? And I'm going, wait, how was that? What? Oh, oh, oh. And, you know, and suddenly it's like you can't even, you know, like that's gone and you're heading somewhere else. And then you start seeing hungry ghosts instead of your, you know, like for a while in the bar you might be seeing your previous people and they can't see you. Then you start seeing hungry ghosts in the bardo, because that's your future mom, you know, like that's your new karma that's ripening. And so you start seeing hungry ghosts, right? And you're trying to remember your past, but you can't go back, right? That body's dead, burned, and so the point is, like, if you're asking how do you meditate on it, so you might meditate like that, right? And keep going through it. And you say, and then I stay there for how long? And it's like this horrible, and I never, and that one, also then you meditate. So in that hungry ghost realm, right? So I imagine me, Lorne, I'm dead, now I'm a hungry ghost. Then I think, okay, in that lifetime, maybe it's like 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 times longer than this life, you know, and I don't create any virtuous karma at all that whole time. All I do is crave and grasp. It's craving and grasping like this realm, right? But I don't have any dharma center to go to. I don't have any teacher. I'm always like starving. It's like, you know, and it's like a place, you know, like vastly worse, you know, and so I created an entire lifetime of thousands and thousands of years only making negative karma, right? And this is where birth and death, and then I die again. And how do I die in that life? With what craving and grasping? Well, it's not going to be, you know, being a hungry ghost, you're not going to be dying. It's unlikely you're going to be dying with some kind of very altruistic mind. I'll die again with hunger, right? Or some kind of, maybe I die angry. Oh, my life was terrible. Why did I have to be this thing? Right? So you die with anger. Then if you die with anger because you're a hungry ghost, then you go to hell realm. Right? Just giving an example. You activate that because the kind of craving and grasping activates a certain kind of karma, right? So it activates a karma that was related to harming others because it's anger, right? And then I take rebirth in a hell, right? Then I'm meditating, right? So that's me now. I was once Lorne, now I'm hell being number 5,862,000, you know, whatever. I'm some hell being, right? And then, you know, in the hell, am I going to create any positive? You know, I'll have ignorance for sure, right? And I'll create actions for sure. What kind of actions will I create? Even in this life, if somebody cuts me off, I get annoyed at them. How am I going to act if I'm in a boiling cauldron and somebody's hitting me over the head or something with a stick or, you know, iron club or, you know, I'm going to be full of rage, right? Like that's, in other words, I'm not beyond that. I haven't realized any kind of, I haven't realized anything that would free me from that. I can't even be, you know, even if here, if somebody just comes up and slaps me in the face, I'd be mad at them. right? I wouldn't think, oh, I wouldn't immediately, my instinctual reaction wouldn't be unbearable love, right? If somebody walked up and went, wow, it would be some kind of annoyance, right? Well, so how am I going to be if I'm in hell and I don't even have a human brain and somebody's doing, so only I'll create negative karma for like millions of years, right? And then what will happen, right? Well, I was born there, I age and die, right? All I did was have ignorance and actions, right? What am I going to grasp at the time of death there, right? Well, again, it's not going to be bodhicitta, right? There's no chance of that. It's going to be some other negative thing, right? Like, and then maybe I was in a hot hell. This is like what happens with it. So I was in a hot hell, right? So then the whole lifetime I was wanting cold, right? So then I die thinking, oh, I just wish I could get someplace cold. I hate this place, So you die like that, then you think we're born in a hell realm. I mean, a cold hell.
Cold
right?
hell.
And then you're in like a frozen block of ice, and you're, the way they call it, like there's one called shivering, and there's one called something just called burr, where your whole life you're saying burr, and, and then you die with that one, and you think, I wish it was hot, right? And then you take rebirth, because that's the craving and the grasping. Right? What's that?
I said, make it
Yeah, yeah.
Really, just because you're hungry after death, you might be born in it couldn't just be, couldn't go back to human realm. I mean, how do you get out of this cycle that once you get into
That's what
the,
we're
are you
asking.
going?
This is what the reason why I'm telling it this way is this is how we should feel. Like that's why I'm doing it like that.
But how about
You're
if
kidding.
you are hungry when you're dying? I mean,
Oh, I see. Yeah, I mean, that's two different. That's a different. Actually, that's a different question. Like in this, I just want to point out. I'll answer your question, but I want to point out something first. It's a good question, but I want to point out first.
I just want asking it anyway.
No, it's a good question actually, but I want to point out first. There is when you're doing this contemplation. If you're really contemplating on renunciation from samsara, then you don't even ask that question at that time. In other words, for yourself. I'm not saying. And here's a good question, but I'm saying when you're meditating, you try to like sort of what's I would say it. You think like a. Let's sort of say this, like you're trying to just meditate on the 12 links, so in other words, so you just think this is the process of samsara. Now, of course, for us on a practical level, we have to answer that question because it's important, like because we may die, and you want to prepare. And I'll say this, like on that one, your question is like, so does it necessarily? What Rinpa Rinpoche actually said, which I thought was very good advice, like every advice he gave was very good, but I thought it was very practical. Was he said for people who are interested in Dharma practice, right, like you are, he said it's good to create, this is just a practical level, that's separate from the 12 links, okay? He said it's good to create a plan in your mind and have a clear plan of like he used to say, sometimes he would say like this, he would say the best case scenario, I'll do some very advanced practice at the time of death. And he said, but then you have to be realistic and say, you know what, it's really hard to do those practices when you're healthy. If you're in pain and you're suffering, could you do them? And he said he knew many people in Tibet who were like good practitioners who could do certain, like let's say a POA or something, right? Transference of consciousness. And he said, and they said, oh, I'm going to do that, and then he saw, and when they were really healthy, they could sit and meditate. And then he said, then as they started getting really sick and sicker and sicker, then they said, oh, I can't do that. I can't do POA anymore or something. I can't because it takes a lot of concentration, and they couldn't. So what he said was. And he said some people can, and he knew some people who did, but he said some people, even if they were good, they couldn't do it because of the nature of what happened when they were dying. So what he said was, look, here's a practical advice. He said make a plan with like what's called a multi-part plan. On best case scenario, I'll do X. Like some kind of very, best case scenario, I'll meditate on emptiness and unify that with the clear light of death, and I'll experience great bliss as I'm dying, and that'll be wonderful. And that's a good plan. But he says, but if you can't meditate well on emptiness when you're healthy, have a backup plan. And so he was saying like, so there might be plan A, B, C, and D or something. You should have like numerous ones. And what he said then is he said like, so let's say you had some advanced practice and then some middling practice. And then he said, but then there are two practices that even if you're in terrible pain, even if you're confused, even if you're hungry, even if you're thirsty, even if you're cold or hot, they won't abandon you. That was, that was the way Rinpoche used to talk. And so one of those is taking refuge. Right? And what the teachings say, very clearly it says this in the teachings, is if you take refuge at the time of death, that's a virtuous mind, and so you won't take rebirth in the lower realms, you'll have a good rebirth, right? So if you just, and that anybody can do, right? You can just think, like, whether it's the Buddha, or if you have a connection to Tara or Avalokiteshvara, or whichever Bodhisattva or Buddha you have a connection to, so if as you're dying you're thinking, oh, I can't do these other things, but but please, even just like somebody said, please Dalai Lama, Avalokiteshvara, Buddha of compassion, guide me through the bardo. May I be of may I have a good rebirth and be of benefit. That if you die like that, then you're okay. In other words, like you won't take rebirth in lower realms. And the other one is taking and giving. And that one Rinpoche really emphasized, because he said, if you get good at taking it, you can't start at the time of death. Because if you haven't done it in your life, you're not going to do it then. But if you practice that some while you were alive, then he said, then when you're dying, whatever suffering comes, even if you're in the worst suffering, you can think, well, everybody goes through, like you actually think. Whereas if you've done it throughout your life, then as you're dying, you start to think, well, everybody goes through this. So may the sufferings of others ripen on me. May my happiness ripen on. Whereas, like, refuge is easier than Tonglen, but Tonglen is also a very practical one if you do it in your lifetime, because, actually it's not so hard, right? Because you realize death comes to me, death comes to everyone. May others' sufferings ripen on me. May my happiness ripen on them. And if you die like that, then you actually take an excellent rebirth, because you died with bodhicitta, right? With love and compassion in your heart. So the idea then would be like to have some kind of a plan in your mind and to practice those. But that's separate from the 12 links to penetration. Does that make sense? But if you practice that, then you'll be okay when you die, because you have a practice to do. But then what? So we can, because we've studied some, we can like do that, right? In other words, we know how to do that. So we should have a plan. But so then when you're contemplating 12 links, though, what you think about though is, so if I forget my plan, what happen? Then what will happen? And then you go through, and then you start over. Does that make sense? And what happens to most people? And what will happen to me if I don't do that? In other words, like if I come to die and I totally forget to take refuge, I totally forget, then it won't, well then it'll be quite difficult, like that. So it's two different things. In other words, one is we should have a plan, and it's quite realistic. In other words, taking refuge is not so difficult to practice, so we can do that.
Just add one thing to this, because I've just been reading about this very issue. I was reading the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. I went back to it. It's a very helpful book.
It's a good book. Yeah, well written.
Yeah, well written. There's an overview. I've read many books since I first read it, but he says that unless you have a practice that you go back to on a daily basis, he says the chances of you doing it at the time of death are almost negligible. So he says you've got to practice whatever. So he believes in the power of practice, but whatever it is, that you do. And he says whether you've integrated it into your consciousness. If, like, for example, in a dream, if something happens to you, do you resort to it? Or in real life, if something bad happens to you, do you resort to it? And he says if you're not resorting to it, and when much lesser things are happening, you can rest assured that you will not resort to it at the time of death. So it's actually a lifetime practice. We actually have an opportunity in our lives, since we have been exposed to these practices. Most people are not exposed to these practices, but if you have exposure to these practices, you've got to choose a practice that you can do. Most of us can't do these higher practices. Choose something you can do, and then practice it all the time, so that it actually becomes second nature. It's like anything.
And I'll mention something about that, like many times, and I think again, like if you contemplate things like 12 links, it starts to make it more real, right? Khenchen Rinpoche oftentimes, here at the center, right, has so many times talked about the importance of refuge, right? Take the practice of, and he sometimes says these things like, I remember when he first said it, I was surprised, and then later it makes more sense, is he was giving these examples, right, of, like some, in Tibet, like some yogis or something who, somebody said to them, oh, you have this kind of concentration where you could do these very advanced practices, and the yogi said, I'm focusing on refuge. And he said, why is that? And he said, well, that's, in other words, when they come to die, they knew, right? Well, refuge practice is something I can rely on. Whereas when I come to die, if I do it every day, then it'll be there for me when I come to die, and I'll be fine, And whereas these advanced practices, they were saying, I think it was a number of things. One is, if you do them without refuge, they don't have that much meaning anyway. They're just some kind of like exercise or something. And the other is like, well, will you be able to do them or not at that time? That's one reason there. And so Khenchen Rinpoche was often emphasizing that he said for us, at our level of practice, right, he often emphasized, he said, look, if you take care of karma, right, if you take care of, because that's something we have to do anyway, right, it's not harm others and be kind, keep keep away from the 10 non-virtuous actions and do the 10 virtuous actions, and then we focus on refuge, right? Then that's enough actually to ensure a good future rebirth, right? Whereas if you do refuge sincerely every day, as you're describing, right, and then you think, okay, when I die, I'll do like that. And when you look at many Tibetan like lay people, practitioners, that's what they do, right? There is you try to avoid 10 non-virtues, and many of them as they die, right, they're thinking of Tara or of Avalokiteshvara or of the Buddha, and that's a very good. If you do that every day, then that's totally realistic.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
All of this makes a lot of sense, and I really appreciate you taking the time to explain to us. I guess I just want to give like a real world situation that happened to me this week. I know that we have to, the cause of all our attachments and our suffering is ignorance. And I know that you have to cut ignorance at the root, because I read that and I appreciated that there really is no way you can cut it anywhere else, because otherwise it keeps growing. But this week I experienced some anger in my heart, and I even want to tell you how silly it was. I was angry because I wish I could hear from my sister more often. It's really this how ridiculous it is. And I kept thinking to myself, I'd like to cut this at the root. And then what I did was, I was like, if I die tomorrow, would I want to have these thoughts in my mind? That's the question I asked myself. And I did not want to have these thoughts in my mind. If I'm going to die tomorrow, I would want to have thoughts towards my sister as well as towards all beings of great love and compassion for them, wishing for them, whatever happiness and peace that they are wanting. But at the same time, I noticed that the anger was very persistent. And I understood from some of my reading that sometimes this anger is an accumulation from many lifetimes. This is just some cause that I'm attributing to it, but the real problem is actually an accumulation of negative states of mind that can build over many lifetimes. And so I thought to myself, I know everything you're saying, but yet I still have this anger, and I want more than anything to release this anger, and yet it was still with me. So I'm just asking, because a very practical issue that arose this week, how does one use these principles that we're describing today to break this? Because I see this as the chain. And then the anger would have then, if I don't stop this, then the anger is going to lead to words, and then the words are going to lead to actions, and then all I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep going and doing the same thing over and over, and I really want to break the chain. So how do I do that?
So I want to say, obviously, I want to say one thing is that there are many other contemplations for patience, right? Like Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, the Patience chapter. It's totally amazing. So one is I would recommend, but I'm not going to cover that now. As mentioned, so one would be to look at Shantideva, for example, or at the Dalai Lama's commentary on that, and then meditate on all these topics of patience. Because then one does, and there's anger can be, one good thing about anger is anger, the bad thing about anger is it's more powerful negative karma when you do it, right? Cause of so much suffering. The good thing about anger is that when you really meditate on those antidotes, it's easier. I believe it's easier to get rid of than desire, because this is the desire realm. It's not the anger realm. So one can sort of desire takes more effort. Anger, if you really meditate on it a lot, you can really decrease it within a few years. Actually, I've seen a lot of people do that. Not a week, but in other words, if you really meditate consistently on patience, within a few years you can see huge change actually in a person. Where they can their level of anger and their frequency of anger can just go down very much. But actually, so there are lots of meditations there. But since you asked, and since we're covering the 12 links, I'll put it in that context, right? So if you were going to meditate on that in the context of the 12 links of dependent origination, right? Then you would think, okay, so first of all, you're not yet meditating on emptiness. That's not what we're doing here. What you would meditate on is this: so you would actually think, okay, so first of all, I won't go through it usually, but you might think I mean, what you did is in line with this, right? But if, you would actually make it more extensive, right? So you would think, you might contemplate like this. Okay, so first of all, for sure, right, I'm grasping at a truly existent I and truly existent her, you know. Thing, I'm independently existent, she's independently existent, right? And then, the anger itself is a mental action, actually, already, right? Like, in other words, that's an action mentally. Then there could be, if it, like you said, if it becomes a verbal action or a physical action, then that's even more, right? And then if you were going to contemplate more, I'm just thinking experientially, right? If you were going to sit there and think, and if you did, you would have to do it very extensively, right? But you would think, so okay, so what is, in this context, right? So what is, what kind of action is that, right? In other words, what's the result of anger, right? And then you would think, you might go through and think, okay, so for sure, actually, if I'm dwelling in and ruminating on anger at her, right? And then I say something angry to her, right? So actually, the first is this: actually, I mean, now I'm getting a little into karma, right? But that is here. The second link is action, right? So you would expand it from what we know from Lamrim, right? The other contemplations we were doing, the whole module we did on karma, right? So the throwing karma of that, right, that will lead to like we're describing here, to a whole rebirth, is only rebirth in the lower realms, actually. Right? There's no way that that's a virtuous action, right? So for sure it leads to rebirth in the lower realms, right? And so if you were contemplating in the context of 12 links, you would think, wow, okay, so like, right now I'm in birth and death, and now I was born, I'm in aging and death, right? I'm going to just start with that link, right? So I'm in that, you know, so this life is very brief, like you were describing, right? And I may die any time, I'm getting older, but right now I'm going back to the first set, right? But in this life, I'm doing those ignorance, creating action, and actually each time I think of her, right, is a separate action, actually, right? So in other words, each time I think, oh, I'm mad at her for doing this, right? And then like, to have a complete throwing karma, it has to be like a complete action, actually, right? To actually throw a whole rebirth. So in other words, because there are incomplete actions and complete actions in the teachings on karma, right? But so let's say I wasn't thinking about karma at all, and I just thought, you know, she didn't call, I'm annoyed at her, what a jerk, you know, something like that, and I'm justified in that because I'm a good brother, she's not a good sister. Right? If one thought like that, right? That's just like a complete karma, right? That's enough to lead to a whole rebirth.
Just that alone.
Just that alone. You know, then if I take it the next step, you know, let's say I have that thought, and then I send her an email saying, you know, I'm really disappointed in you and your crappy sister. You know, and then I think, well, I was pretty justified, she is, you know, compared to what a wonderful brother I am, and I sent her such a nice present, and whatever, something. Like, right, actually that one includes pride and anger, then, you know, I'm just giving examples here, right? Like, so, each of those actually creates a cause for an entire rebirth. And then you think, of what kind of rebirth, right? So you die, and then, like, let's say the person's dying, right? And they're feeling lonely, right? And because it's a lonely process, right? And they're grasping, and so you die with the craving and grasping for, like, companionship, right? Because dying is very lonely. We all die alone, actually, right? And then that activates some karma, right? So let's say at the end of my life, of this life or some future life, I'm dying, and the feeling I have is not so much about the cold or the heat or hunger, but I'm thinking, you know, like, let's say you're laying in your bed and you're thinking, nobody comes visit me, actually, right? Because actually people don't like visit, right? Oftentimes people don't like visiting dying people because it's disturbing to them, right? I feel I'm going to live forever. I don't want to go somewhere where it's reminding me of everybody dies and all that, so I don't go, right? So now I'm dying. Nobody wants to come see me, right? So I'm feeling quite lonely, and also I start to feel angry. Hey, I was nice to people.
It's actually the same feeling that you might feel.
Yeah, and so you think like that. You think, so I'm going to be dying, right? And what I'm going to be feeling is, well, all these people, I was nice to them. They don't even come see me. This is the time where I need support. Nobody even showed up, right? And so you die with that kind of feeling, and you feel angry. Then for sure, right, that activates the kind of karma. And you take rebirth in some horrible, actually, like, you know, give example, right? It could be any number of realms, right? But actually, when you read about some of those cold hells, right? Where it's like there's this desolate, take rebirth someplace like the middle of Arctic, you know, like Antarctica or something, where there's nobody around. It's just like these howling winds, and you're naked, freezing cold, and you know, like so I activate that kind of karma, actually, you know, like, and then I'll take rebirth like that because of this habit of mine of feeling this way, right? And then if you start to contemplate, so you would actually I mean, if you're putting it in 12 links, right? So then you would think, oh my God, like until you would feel Nagarjuna, Arya Nagarjuna gives an example one place, I think, where he says, if you contemplate it deeply enough and you really get this, he said, it'll be like a person who's holding a stick when it touches, if you're holding a stick that's on fire, like a match, and when the fire touches your finger, he said you drop it right away, something like that. Or if you're holding something that's burning you, right? He said, like, if you start to understand what's going on with this process, right? If in the context, and now I'm just talking in the context of 12 links though, then a feeling will arise of like, oh my God, I can't do that. Like, this is like, where even the beginning to feel that way, right? You would like think, oh, wait, like, because it would be terrifying actually. In other words, for you, but if we don't contemplate it over and over again, then it just seems normal, right? Whereas if you don't contemplate, like in the context of how that leads to the cycle of samsara over and over, then you just think, well, that's normal. Everybody gets mad, and which everybody does. If that's true, it's not contradicting, but except Aryas and so on. But in this context, if you start, so you would meditate over and over. You see that the problem is that it requires a lot of repetition, because if you just, if you're feeling angry, like let's say if I get mad at somebody. And then I think, well, how does that fit into the 12 links of dependent origination? Now, what are the 12 links again? And like, there's something about craving and grasping, and I don't know. In other words, it's not going to do anything, right? But if you go over and over in a visceral way, like, what's it like then? And then you're like have these aggregates, right, of being a hell being, a cold hell, and you're alone, and you don't see anybody for an eon or two, and then you take rebirth again as a human being, but again you have this karma like that because. What's the karma of anger? Well, it pushes people away, right? Like, in other words, one of the things of anger is it pushes people away, and so then again, I'll be not have good companions, because actually, one of the causes of having good, good companions is patience. Actually, and again, like if you start to contemplate this a lot in terms of the nature of karma, then one starts to feel like both. This is not yet even about ignorance, right? But one starts to feel more and more responsibility, like, okay, so, again, like, so then there's another way of doing the same contemplation. Why do I feel I don't have good companions in this life? Well, because in a past life, I was impatient, right? Because that's not the throwing karma, that's like the completing karma, right? Because I have a good rebirth now, but my other karmas that sort of fill in the colors of this life are other actions I did in past lives. So in past lives, I was impatient. One of the karma of impatience is you don't have good. That's one of the karmas, is that you don't have good companions, right? Other karmas also are, there are other karmas that create not good. It's not just impatience. There are also other ones like sexual misconduct or things like, there are all different ones. But anyway, my point there is like again, one starts to think. Then one looks at bad experiences, right? One thinks, well, I created the causes of those, right? In the past, now they're manifesting as these results. And again, you start to what happens then is that then you look at like, okay, this experience, right? This person's not calling. I'm just giving an example how I might meditate, right? And one feels, wow, so what I have to do is be patient and be ethical and be, in other words, it's actually this experience is a teaching that, right? Because otherwise, due to the process of the cycle of birth and death, this will continue happening endlessly, right? So we're not yet at emptiness. We're still looking at karma in that one. The karmic cause and karmic result. But then I want to emphasize one more point. Then, how you get to the point of emptiness with this, right? And so I want to go back, like whether you're thinking of that example or you're just thinking in general about dying and all those other examples I gave earlier. And notice how when we talked about that, people started to feel disturbed a little bit, right? That's good. That's the idea. In other words, if you do this 12 links, you should get more and more disturbed in a way. And then eventually, what happens is, right? This is the point. Like, so whether you're thinking about that, like cold hell, and always having difficulties with people, or you're thinking about the other thing about grasping at food or grasping at reputation or whatever thing, you go through it in different angles. As you use experiences like that as a meditation in this, right? You would think, okay, what's the cause of that? What's the result of that? What kind of future rebirth does that lead to? What kind of causes in past lives created this, right? This is how you're thinking if you're contemplating the 12 links. So eventually what happens is, if you start to really feel like that feeling of discomfort, where you're like, oh, this is like horrific, and it can go on and on endlessly, and I'm creating so many causes for future rebirths just in this life, and this is like the best opportunity anybody in the universe has, and yet most of the time I'm making bad seeds, bad choices and creating bad seed, bad karmic seeds. which will lead to more bad results, and like, this is the one time I ever have a chance to break out of that, but I'm not really doing it, right? And what will happen is, then if you start focusing on, so the weak link is wisdom, right? Because actually that's just, that disturbed feeling is just the beginning, you know. Then what you want to do is you want to see, so actually, you would then contemplate, right? So it's grasping at a truly existent or independent self on the aggregates, right? And yet that doesn't even exist. Like, so all of this is caused by something that's not even, like grasping at something that's totally a hallucination or not true, right? And then you would start to feel, especially in the context of these other contemplations, you would become almost like obsessed, actually, like I have to break that. I have to do it in this life. You know, because you can see how somebody, if you kept contemplating that way, right, over and over again on the 12 links and how you take rebirth, and it's always in this suffering, and you know, and there's so many types of suffering, and then once you have the aggregates, you can't break out of it, right? And once you have a certain kind of body and mind, and you're stuck in that one for a whole lifetime until you die, then you would start to feel, but I can actually break it now. Like I've been doing this for countless eons. I could continue this for countless eons, but all the teachings here right now are here, where I could actually realize wisdom and destroy the link of ignorance. And you start to feel, if I don't do that, then I would be like there's nothing more stupid than that. Actually, like you would feel like they use analogies sometimes in the teachings, right? Like it'd be like you know, if a person who's lived their whole life in poverty were suddenly surrounded by like diamonds worth millions of dollars and they didn't pick one up, right? Like, they were like, oh, I'm too distracted right now. I'll come back later, and they went back home and lived the rest of it. You would say, well, what the hell are you doing? You know, it's like almost impossible to be that stupid. You know, like you would look, and you say, oh, that's me though. I'm that stupid because. Like, the teachings on the Madhyamaka Prasangika view exist, right? Lama Tsongkhapa made them so clear. It's so easy to, like, you know, like, not that it's easy to understand, but it's like, it's so easily accessible compared to anywhere else. You know, like, these kind of very clear teachings. I have a kind of body where I could achieve calm abiding, and I could actually do all that. So I could actually go through those stages and realize emptiness, and destroy that, and be free forever from these links. And you start to feel like, almost like we're a healthy obsession, where you would think, I have to do that then. You know, like it's totally, there's no other choice. I have to like study and meditate on that. You know, and at this point you don't go meditate on emptiness though. You just keep staying with, I have, like the feeling, because that's actually the beginning of renunciation, right? This feeling of that's unbearable, and this is the solution. And actually what you're trying to do is develop like because it would be a mistake if at that point you stopped meditating on 12 links and went and ran off to meditate on emptiness, because then that would sort of be like, oh, phew, okay, I meditated for a half hour on emptiness, I'm better now, right? And now I won't think about that again. That's not what you do here, like, because you're getting at, how do you study, contemplate, and meditate? You would actually hold yourself on this topic, right? You wouldn't escape to go, okay, now I'm just going to go meditate a little bit on emptiness. Because again, we're still beginners, right? So if you just meditated for like a week on dependent origination, then you thought, okay, yeah, I don't want to stay in samsara, I want to meditate. And then you read one book, you know, you might pick up like a Jeffrey Hopkins meditation on emptiness, you know. Say, okay, I'm going to read that, and then you would get like this far into it, and then you'd say, well, okay, I read part of Jeffrey Hopkins' Meditation on Emptiness. Now what's on TV or something? You know, it's not like that. You know, if you really want to do what you're describing, you know, like you would actually stay with the 12 links until you felt, like the teachings say, right? Until like Lama Tsongkhapa, or who said it? Oh no, the Panchen Lama said. The first Panchen Lama said. He said, actually, what will happen if you meditate enough on this is, he said, you'll come to feel that samsara is like a prison, right? And that like you're like a death row inmate. And he gives this analogy where he says, even when you think about better rebirths, that's why I said you wouldn't, or as I said, you had asked a very good question, you should ask it, but then, and it was good that we talked about it, I think, but then the Panchen Lama says, if you meditate on this enough, he said, you come to feel like this. He said, what's the analogy? He said, imagine a death row inmate, right, who's going to be killed in 1 month's time, and every day is being tortured. And then like a high official comes, this is the Panchen Lama said. He said, then a high official comes and says, he's only got a month till he dies, let's stop torturing him. And then like, you know, and then you hear, they say, okay, we're going to stop torturing you because, you know, you're dead in a month anyway. You're not worth our time to torture. Right? He said, the Panchen Lama says, you'll feel like that prisoner. Well, it's not that big a relief, really. Whereas like, you know, I've been tortured up to now, you know, you give me a month off from torture, but then you're going to, you know, then you're going to kill me. That's not good enough. I have to get out of here. You know, like that's the, he said, the Panchen Lama said, you'll start to feel even about good rebirths like that. Whereas, yes, it's better than being tortured, but I'm still on death row and I'm still going to be, killed. He said that's the visceral experience of somebody who's meditated on this. Either way, renunciation. What we're getting is what is renunciation? Actually, he said the feeling will be like that. In other words, yes, I want good future rebirths, but that's not nearly enough. I want to realize emptiness. I want to become liberated from this cycle.
So meditation on the 12 links leads to renunciation. Is that the bottom line?
Yeah, eventually there's a way of meditating on the 12 links, in the context of meditation on emptiness too, like Nagarjuna presents. But that's not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about just that, just to realize renunciation. Yeah.
So when you meditate on the 12 links, it leads to renunciation. That's what this whole discussion is about.
Yeah, here we're talking about meditating on 12 links in order to give rise to that sense of renunciation.
But it could be anything, right? I mean, you could use it to give rise to bodhicitta even too, understanding suffering and wanting all beings to be free of it.
Yeah, although renunciation has to come first, of course. So yeah, but then you can go back to those. In other words, because it's just like any empathy, right? In other words, if you realize it for yourself, then you can go. But once you've realized that for yourself, then you can go back and think, like if I do that enough for myself, then I could go back and think, oh wow, but also, Jen also has those 12 links, and like I could then meditate like that, and then start developing compassion, and and then I could go on to other people, and Gabe does too, and so on, and you expand it outward. But you have to start with yourself, of course.
So like this one contact, how, can you explain contact, like when you contact, what happens, like?
Yeah, contact just means like I'll give an example, like, in other words, contact means you have to have the three things I said, like, so there has to be a sensory object to perceive. You have to have the organ, like, the ear, right? Like, let's say it's ear. Take that as an example, right? So there has to be a sound. You have to have an ear, and you have to also have an ear consciousness, right? Because in other words, because if a corpse has an ear, they don't hear, because you have to have the consciousness there, right? And so all it is that. So like, let's say, so in other words, so if you're not deaf, you have the ear, and then let's say you're driving by and somebody's playing music, well then you hear it, right? Because there's the sensory object of the person's music, there's the ear organ, and then there's your consciousness, and so you hear that music, right? That'd be an example of contact. And then that would give rise to then let's say if you don't like that music, right? Then you go, you roll up your window or something. That would be, or is that would be. I'm just describing so the context is just the simple contact, right? In other words, when the sound waves hit your eardrum, and then the consciousness is there, aware of it. That's contact, right? Then feeling might be like immediate, some feeling of displeasure, and then grasping would be, oh, I don't want to hear that. I want silence, right? And you roll up your window. So it'd be like those three.
So can you like, if you meet a contact, an object, can you just like, instead of reacting, can you just cut?
Cut it at contact.
Yeah.
According to, I guess there are a couple of things. I mean, one is that, again, this is for contemplation.
Yeah.
Like, let's say this right. Like, actually, if you think about it this way, that if you think about how spiritual practice and that, there are two different answers. On the one hand, as long as you have sensory organs, right, and you're on this planet, let's say you're on Earth, right, and you're a human being, there is going to be some contact, right? Like, even if you're alone in a quiet hut, you'll hear a bird, and like that. So in one way, you can't stop that process, right? And then when you hear that, you can't help that there is going to be feeling. Because actually, feeling in Buddhist psychology is considered what they call an omnipresent mental factor. It's always there. So you're always either neutral, positive, or negative about things. So you can't stop the fact that you have. Whereas, like when you hear a bird, either you think, "Oh, that's pretty," or "Oh, I don't like that. That bird's annoying. I don't like that sound." Whereas, like there's you can't escape that. Even whether they're pretty or neutral, at least it's going to be there. But you can intervene. So I think you're right. In other words, I'll give an example. Like I remember one time Lama Zopa Rinpoche was pointing out about Kirti Senchip Rinpoche. Some of you met him, right? You guys know. Lama Zopa Rinpoche once pointed out about Kirti Senchip. He said if you watch Kirti Senchip Rinpoche walking around, he's like a totally pure monk. Where he's just looking like this, kind of right where he's going, and every now and then he looks up to make sure everything's okay, and he looks back down. Whereas this quality of, because he's aware, whereas he's showing the activity of a monk. Whereas that monks, part of the goal of a monk or a nun, is to decrease some of the reason why they choose that lifestyle. One reason, at least, one of the parts of it, is to have less, or is to have less attachment and aversion, right? And how do you have less attachment and aversion? We'll have less contact and less feeling. And so you try to decrease some of that. You can't escape totally, right? In other words, it doesn't matter how, how pure a monk or nun you are, still there's going to be some contact. But of course there's less, right? In other words, if you're living a more renounced lifestyle, there's going to be less of that. And so there are ways we can intervene in those, right? Like in other words, to make it easier on us. But there'll still be some. Does that make sense? But yeah, it's very practical. Because of course, like, if you try to meditate in a rock concert, it's going to be quite difficult. And so you have to decide for yourself. That's also part of the teachings, right? Is you have to figure out for yourself, well, how much can I, how much contact and how much sensory stimulation can I handle without becoming totally overwhelmed? And you have to kind of judge that, try to modify things accordingly. But there'll still be some feeling, of course there's still some contact and feeling. Even if you're eating very bland food, well, still, you might like it, you might dislike it, and so on. So, does that make sense?
So it's just to reduce a lifestyle that you choose can either reduce or increase what your level of attachment and grasping. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, of course, yeah. And so you have to judge for yourself and be wise about that. That is the point. And again, you see how these, like actually, you see how, what you guys are getting at, we'll stop in a minute, but I just want to point out, you see how it's very practical, these 12 links, right? Whereas once you start contemplating, you start to see, because it teaches all that, right? Whereas if you actually contemplate them enough, whereas then you relate it back, well, why do people, whereas like you can see why somebody contemplating this would become a monk or a nun sometime. I'm not saying we should or something. Because how somebody contemplates enough and they go, well, there's too much sensory thing and I can't meditate, and therefore I'm not realizing, like, in other words, you can see how somebody could think that, right? One person could meditate on these and then say, they develop a certain kind of renunciation, they say, I've got to get a quieter lifestyle, I've got to get a simpler environment, and then meditate on emptiness and so on. So I think this teaches many different things if you look at the different parts of those 12 links, and that's what you're starting to, each of you, I mean, the questions you guys are asking, you're starting to see that, right? Whereas you look at the one about death and grasping, and you start to realize a certain thing. You look at the one about contact, and then contact, feeling, and then, craving and grasping, and again, you start to realize you can't break the link there, but you can decrease it, right? Like, you can't break the cycle at feeling, right? Because feelings, you can't just get rid of them. You can get rid of ignorance, but you start to realize, well, if I want to get rid of ignorance, I have to do something at that, on that level. It's teaching me something experientially that I have to kind of adjust my lifestyle. So it's very practical. We'll just maybe I'll just say a couple quick practical things, and then let's dedicate, and then we'll say practical. So anyway, you guys know how, but let's dedicate a few. Like one is what is that one? The Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. And then in the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chen Rezik, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Then we can dedicate that, all of us here, continue to study, contemplate, and meditate. We can dedicate the merit so we can have success in our meditation on 12 links of dependent origination, on renunciation in general. So having realized renunciation, then we can also apply our wisdom, understanding our own suffering to others, and thereby generate bodhicitta. We dedicate the merit so to gain those realizations of renunciation, and then based on that of bodhicitta, and based on that, to realize calm abiding and special insight, especially insight into the nature of emptiness, and thereby we actually all become free from samsara and become perfect guides to others with perfect compassion, wisdom, and skill in order to benefit all beings, liberating all beings from the cycle of birth, aging, sickness, and death.